Good afternoon and welcome to Duncan Toplis On Air for our special Autumn Statement edition. I'm delighted to be joined by Nicholas Smith, who is our Head of Tax, and Nick and the team have been digesting the Chancellor's statement this afternoon. We're going to go through a few elements now before we leave the team to digest further ahead of our webinar on Friday. So, Nick, inflation's now at 4.6%, and there had been expectations of delaying tax changes until the spring. But we've seen a little bit of action today from the Chancellor. What have been your main takeouts?
Yes, they certainly have, Caroline, and thank you for inviting me today to your On Air. But before I go into the announcements themselves, I think it's worth just stepping back and thinking about the format and the way things work. We were told that the Chancellor would introduce an annual budget, which he would talk about tax changes. We'd have an autumn statement to talk about government spending. And it seems that there's a little bit of perhaps political rhetoric that's starting to creep into these things, where there was a time when there was a budget purdah and before statements were made, the Chancellor wouldn't say anything at all. And yet now you see in the press, well, a month ago, Jeremy Hunt saying that there will be no tax changes. And then we noticed over the last perhaps only 4 or 5 days that there's been that rhetoric around perhaps looking forward to next year's general election, and Rishi Sunak making some announcements about tax, and we saw some today, didn't we? I think my biggest takeout was probably the amount of money that the government believe will be spent on business investment. That remains to be seen as to how effective that might be. It was certainly billed as a statement for business, and perhaps the national insurance and the capital allowances were probably the two largest announcements that came out today.
So I suppose it certainly was headlined as a statement that would support businesses, £20 billion for businesses, and clients listening today will be keen to understand a little bit more about the impacts of what Jeremy Hunt has said. Has he indeed backed business?
Yes, I think overall that's true. I think there are several elements that we need to look at, though. There was a lot about investment, especially encouraging businesses and investors to invest rather than government spending its own money. I don't know if you heard that as well as I did, but there was a lot about the changes in business rates in terms of retaining those reliefs that have been with us for the last few years, certainly since the pandemic, and supporting the hospitality industry, and then the capital allowances for the full expensing. But what I think I took away from it was a lot about, he announced there were going to be 110 growth plans. Now that is so many growth plans, and he did say there is no way we can talk about all of these in his statements. And as you said earlier, the team and I will sit down this afternoon and we'll digest the announcements as they've come out and actually decide what they actually mean. But 110, it's almost like little interferences in lots of little places to try and build, I suppose, a momentum perhaps for the business and the economy of this country. So yeah, overall, an interesting time, but I think we'll really need to look at the detail this afternoon, as I say, and come back to that.
Yeah, and I suppose some elements of detail that were shared with us directly were around the increase in the national living wage to £11.44, and also quite a big change in employee NI moving from 12 to 10%. What's your initial thoughts on those changes?
I think I'll start with the national insurance first, because it wasn't just the employed that were affected, but also the self-employed. There was a 1% reduction for the self-employed in terms of the national insurance that they pay, and as you say, a 2% reduction for employees. That in itself will certainly create a little bit more inflation. People will have a little bit more money in their pockets. It's not huge sums. We're talking sort of £400 or £500 a year for the employed, assuming they're in full-time work. Let's not forget there are also inflationary pressures in terms of the universal credit increase, which I think went up by 6.7%, or will do in April, and state pensions by 8.5%. You referred earlier to the inflation rate of 4.6%, which was the number for October. The Chancellor said, well, they're going to go back to the September figure for those universal credits, just so that those on benefits are not adversely affected too much. Talking about the national living wage, yes, I mean that went up by 9.8%, or will do in April next year, and that alongside the other rates, the national minimum wage, which went up by nearly 15% and over 20% for those younger workers aged 16 to 20, which must have inflationary pressures. And inflationary pressures on businesses. So we talked earlier, didn't we, about what impact has this autumn statement had on businesses? Well, for those in, let's say, the leisure sector or the care industry, who perhaps have employees that are paid at lower rates, that's going to have a huge inflationary impact for them and pressure on their business in terms of needing to, in order to maintain profit margins, they're going to have to increase their fees somehow. And that in itself will create inflationary pressures. So I think the Chancellor's perhaps walking a tightrope between getting the growth in the economy and not overinflating, having inflationary pressures again. So I think it's going to be quite tight, I think.
Yeah, and lots to think about over the next couple of days. I suppose a big theme in the media in the last few days, which didn't come up in today's statement, was around inheritance tax. Do you think there might be more to come on this?
Interesting, isn't it? Certainly, it's one of the areas where the Conservative government differs quite markedly from the Labour Party in terms of what they're talking about. The Labour Party spend a lot of time talking about removing reliefs. The Conservatives talk quite a lot about even abolishing inheritance tax altogether, which seemed a really brave move. You've got to replace it with something, surely. That doesn't quite make sense. But that's probably one of those things they'll leave until the March budget. And if he wants to bring out some rabbit out of the hat that might appease what he believes to be his voters, or the Conservatives' voters, that might be when it comes out. I certainly think people will continue to talk about it. It's a very emotive subject. Inheritance tax really hasn't changed very much for years. The rates have been pretty constant over that period of time in terms of the thresholds, and the rate itself hasn't changed in my memory for as long as I've been doing tax, and believe me, that's quite a long time now. So I think there's always going to be talk about it because it's so emotive. People talk about the fact that they've earned their money during their lives, they've paid tax on it, and then when they come to die, their estates have to pay tax on effectively assets that have been bought out of taxed income. But there are lots of arguments about where on earth does the government get money from. You can't have a situation where we build wealth within individuals and we don't think about the next generation and how they're going to be able to afford. We talked about state pensions earlier. How are the next generation going to be able to afford to pay their taxes in order to pay for, in years to come, yours and my state pension? I think it's a worrying situation for the government to be in, and certainly they need to do something about it. Abolishing inheritance tax, I'm not sure that's really the answer.
So quite a lot to consider from what was pitched as a relatively quiet statement today. I know that you and your team will be looking over the detail over the next couple of days, and Duncan Toplis have their webinar on Friday at 10 o'clock. I'd urge listeners, if you haven't already, to visit the Duncan Toplis website and register for your place so that you can tune in and join the team. But the big question is, will you all be ready to share your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really big question, Caroline, isn't it? I'm sure there'll be lots of statements. If there are really 110 growth plans, then there must be lots of statements out there ready for us to read. The team are already downloading them, I know, as we're sat here now, and I'll go and join them shortly, and we'll go through those. But we will be ready. Yeah, we're ready to answer those questions, and we'll be looking out for those things that we think will affect our region and our clients and our community, in terms of those proposed changes that will be in there. So we'll be ready. 10 o'clock on Friday morning. I'll be chairing our webinar, and I know the team will be ready to present that.
That's excellent, and sorry to have interrupted your day, but I know our listeners will really welcome you sharing your thoughts this early on. Thank you so much, Nick.
Thanks for inviting me.